And welcome back to Contract A. This is the third and final video in our week 1 series on theory. So let's plunge into the third video. And drum roll, here we have, you've been waiting for this, haven't you? Relational contracting. Okay, my favourite theory, my theory du jour, if you will. The dominant theme here is that contracts are rooted in human relation. And as McNeill begins his treatise in a rather biblical sense, he says, in the beginning was society. And he says that this is the most forgotten fact in the modern study of contracts. Everybody seems to have really left out of the equation the whole communal side of our life, the whole social side of our being. And he says, well, if you're going to do that, you're running into dangerous territory, particularly, and he has a real bugbear with what he calls neoclassical contract theory, which I kind of briefly mentioned when we were talking about classical theory. Classical theory has kind of been rebooted and reshaped to account for some of the criticisms that have been made of it over the years. But it really does rely a lot on economic theory and its idea of, you know, the rational maximizer looking after their own self-interests. And if we're all just looking after our own self-interests, then, you know, optimum allocation of market resources will happen and you won't get market failure and that kind of thing, or it'll be minimised, except if things go wrong. And now there's a theory, lots of exceptions. But he says contracts between rational maximisers is not contract at all, it's just war. If you've got a bunch of, sneaky opportunists that are going to knife each other in the back as soon as they possibly can, well, really, is that what contracts are all about? Is the only value of contract that of the efficient exchange of resources? Probably not, he says. So let's have a little look at the background. Relational contracting, another one that rose to prominence in the 1980s. It had been chuffing around since Stuart Macaulay's work in the 1960s, and in fact McNeill got going not long after Macaulay's work at all, and Macaulay was a card-carrying fan of McNeill, and I'm sure McNeill had a soft spot for Macaulay. I have put Macaulay's preliminary 1960s study up on Moodle for you if you're interested in having a bit of a read of that, not essential by any stretch of the imagination. But what prompted this theory? Well, McNeill was quite dissatisfied with the whole individualism that was inherent in so much of the theory that had gone before. Like I said, particularly ticked off with the whole rational maximizer thing. And here's where it gets kind of interesting. Most of the other theorists rely on their philosophical view and making a compelling philosophical argument for their theory in a kind of post hoc fashion, constructing it all together. McNeill calls himself a casual empiricist, and what he says is, I haven't just kind of come up with this theory and then kind of tried to join all of the dots and sweep all of the contractual doctrines into this little, holding pen. What I've done is I've had a good hard look, starting with Macaulay's earlier work, looking at how contracts actually operate in the marketplace. What goes on in the real world? Now, Macaulay, for those of you that haven't read that little article, did this really nice study of some American manufacturers in the 60s. Now, bear in mind, this was a very small scale study and in one particular industry only. And bear in mind, it was the 1960s, so arguably, things like reputation and personal dealings and that kind of thing were possibly more important to commerce and the way you did business in those days. But often in situations where you have repeat business being sought and a longer term commercial relationship to be built, you will have the parties planning the contract far, far less. And in fact, once you've got the contract on foot, you've signed off some T's and C's, that thing goes in the bottom drawer and the parties proceed to perform roughly according to convention, business customs, give and take, handshake, nod and a wink and a smile. And it's all about the relationship. If you want that other party to do right by you in future, you're probably going to do right by them right now, where you've got the choice between not doing right by them and doing right by them. So contracts, the actual written form of the contracts, really recede into the background, and what comes to the foreground is relation. Okay, now McNeill never really set out to devise a theory. He was just very interested in conducting a sociological study of the swamp and what happens in the swamp. And he really was just observing, making a stack of comments on his observations. However, these comments and those observations just went on and on and on and on over a period of more than 20 years, and eventually people started speaking of it as a theory. Grudgingly, to my mind anyway, he started calling it a theory in about 2000-ish. What are the most recognised bits of his theory? Probably that contract formation doesn't happen at one particular point in time, as I'm about to tell you in future weeks. When a contract is formed, offer, acceptance, you've got the terms being agreed, you've got consideration, and bingo, you hear the sound of the irons being clamped on, and the contract is actually binding on the parties. Now, he says that's a bit of a furphy. In actual fact, what happens is there's a lot of give and take, negotiation, relationship building, and gradually, consent and contract formation actually happens over a period of time. The other thing that is his most well recognised contribution is this spectrum or continuum of contract behaviour. I'll talk about that in just a moment. So that's a little backgrounder on relational contracting. Let's have a look at hallmarks. Okay, now I started to lead into this before, but the main hallmark of relational contracting is this notion of a spectrum or continuum. And on the one side, you've got discrete contracting, and on the other side, you have relational contracting. At the discrete end, you have a number of things that would indicate that your contract falls towards this end. One-off spot exchanges. McNeill gives the example of buying gas at a gas station. Okay, you have very, very little, if any, interaction, and very, very little, if any, probability of that personal interaction, the repeat business that Macaulay, for example, was interested in his 1960s work. So McNeill even says, look, with contracts at this really discrete end, you can almost do the thing and get out of there with whatever it is that you want to get with no interaction at all, because think about it. You rock up to the petrol station, you don't speak to anybody, you put the petrol in your car, it's full, you put it back in the thing, you go into the petrol station, you look at the person, they or you might say pump number 3, you might nod, you present your card to be debited at the transaction point at the FPOS machine, and then you leave. Job done. Quite minimalistic in its social relation. Now, there has to be a tiny bit of social relation there because, you know, as McNeil says, you know, the discrete contracting stops us from doing things like filling our tank with petrol and, you know, simply stabbing someone when they come to chase us for money. There are some implicit rules behind that transaction. You know, there has to be a bit of shared language between the parties. There has to be a system of money. There has to be conventions and that kind of thing, but very minimal at the discrete end of contracting. Conversely, if you look at the relational side of things, you have contracts that are deeply embedded in relation, particularly, and as the business literature has come to appreciate McNeil, and I guess that's where he's really probably had most effect, actually, rather than in strict contract law circles, where he was a bit of a pariah for many years. Can I say? Go the underdog. Particularly at the relational end, you'll find complex deals, highly uncertain deals, and deals that involve this notion of repeat exchange, long-term relationships. Now, where you've got this kind of contract, this kind of exchange happening, it's interesting. McNeil says, like Macaulay, pretty much before him, the contract kind of goes into the bottom drawer. In fact, oftentimes, the parties don't even bother too much about the contract terms and conditions. It's far more important that the relational aspects are settled and performing well. The T's and C's kind of drop into the background. So at the discrete end, where lawyers are probably most comfortable, you would have lawyerly activity in terms of contracts being a flurry of trying to capture every possible contingency that might go wrong. That's the notion of discrete contracting. Planning and what he calls presentiation, or fully capturing every contingency in a contract, tends to happen where, if it's not a discrete transaction that's already got terms and conditions pretty much settled, like the gas exchange thing, but where you're actually sitting down to write a contract at the discrete end of things, it's all about the planning, because there's almost no trust. There's almost no relationship. So you got to capture everything on that document. It's super important, and that's where lawyers come in, you know, with our pens and our doctrines, and we say, no, you can't negotiate that term because it's not commercially favourable, and this contractual doctrine says that you can't do that. And you end up with a 20-page document for really what is about a one-page transaction. Relational contracts you tend to approach in a very different manner. And the International Association of Commercial and Contracts Managers, the IACCM, has done a lot of work with the Australian Navy on this, because the Australian Navy was having all sorts of bother with delivering on time with its submarine operations. And so what they did is they turned to the notion of relational contracting, and instead of putting a minutiae approach into action where you focus very much on the T's and C's and the bargaining and the to and froing and the adversarial nature of the parties, they really focus on getting the relational side of things focused first, the relationship operating properly, a whole set of processes and systems put in place as to how the parties will deal with each other in the course of performance, how they will settle their disputes, and clearly defined off-ramps for the relationship. And that's really what then tends to set the scene for a much more relaxed approach to coming down to the actual terms and conditions of the deal that's on the table. So that's relational contracting in a nutshell. I hope we can have some discussion about this at the Zoom, because it's really quite an interesting field, and it's one that I'm currently researching at the moment, so I'm kind of fired up about it. Looking at criticism of relational contracting, there is none, no. Only joking. The main thing, I guess, is that critics tend to point to it and say, oh, look at this body of work over 20, 30 years of McNeil. You know, it's this big anthropological, almost sociological inquiry. There's no clear or determinate legal principles that come out of this theory. I guess that makes sense, because the way that McNeil went into this whole exercise was, you know, how can I define legal principle in light of what I'm seeing? He just set out to map what was actually happening, you know, and then it was kind of afterwards that his theory unpacked itself almost as he thought about the ramifications of what he was seeing for contractual doctrine. And then he started, once he, you know, had mapped out this spectrum, this continuum, he started mapping, you know, the kinds of norms that would appear where you tended to see relational contracting occurring. Interestingly enough, you know, trust features among this kind of norm. The harmonization of relation or trust and keeping each other happy is one of the main norms that comes out of a relational contracting viewpoint. So he unpacks to about 10 different norms that you will see at the relational contracting end of the spectrum. So yeah, he didn't really have this theoretical approach to start with. There has been some difficulty applying relational theory in practice. How exactly do you go about harnessing the insights that McNeil has provided for us? And this is where the business literature has tended to focus on these norms that McNeil mapped out. Contract managers, like the membership of the IACCM, you know, they've focused on relational contracting as a process, how to guide your clients towards a happy conclusion, how to get them into contracts that stand a very good chance of working well, even though they might be really high value, highly uncertain, very, very complex deals that you can't capture in full and put in every contingency into the contract. Courts, what have courts done with this? Interestingly, and this kind of puts a nice spin on the videos, because, you know, I said at the very beginning, theory can help where you're at the pointy end of judicial decision making, and courts are grappling with how to decide a particular case. And particularly, as I said, in the UK, we've had Mr. Justice Leggett looking at relational contracting where there are these kinds of long-term complex deals on foot that have come before him for a dispute, classifying the contract as a relational contract, and then being prepared to do stuff in terms of implying terms like the term of, like the duty of good faith into the contract, and then of course that has implications for how the parties go about their business. I've put up a couple of articles, as I said previously, on that, and I think that that's probably as good a place as any to stop with relational contracting. If you have some queries about it, or you'd like to know a little bit more about it, please let me know, because it's kind of fun to explore. So that's relational contracting, and that's theory in a not so quick nutshell. two thought bubbles, as I said at the beginning. Where are we now? Okay, we've had a little look at theory. Ta-da! Here we are in the legal universe. This is really just to say, in the terms of grand design, and I guess it's I liked this picture because it kind of reminded me of Stephen Hawking. It's like this 3D imaging of our closest galaxies. And it's kind of, I guess, a nice visual as to how tough it is to develop theory about law. And in fact, one theory that I kind of like is that law is like a fractal. You know, it's constantly changing, and whilst there is some pattern, you know, each little iteration is kind of different. But we have a number of bodies of law that you need to be aware of and that you'll probably encounter sooner or later if you haven't already. Contract law obviously is at the center of the universe. Not really. But for us in this unit it is. Equity is another body of law that we need to know about. And that's why I've given you some of the readings from Patterson on the role of equity. Equity really focuses on the way that it can assist to provide remedies where the common law remedy would be quite harsh. And we encounter equity in Contract B much more so than in Contract A. So I'm not going to labour the point. Have a bit of a read of Patterson. Just be aware that there are equitable doctrines that cut across contract law that we will need to talk about in Contract B. The other main body of law that you've heard me talk a little bit about tonight is tort law, and you would call that more public law because that's what's imposed on you by the state, whereas contract law is often called private law because that's what parties assume for themselves. And the other body of law that I've got sitting out to the side there is unjust enrichment, bless, because, well, unjust enrichment does cut across some of contract law because it underpins restitutionary law. Again, it's something that we'll encounter in Contract B. It's kind of dark matter. You could write many PhDs on unjust enrichment and restitutionary law. So I've got it hanging off to the bottom there, but you'll discover that for yourself when we do Contract B. So that's where we are in the legal universe. We've had a little look at theory. We know that law is an extremely complex social phenomena to think about. Contract law is a subset of that. And more to the point, what's going on in this unit and the next one? How does it all fit together? I kind of call Contract A the prequel because we do all of the formation stuff, and I went through some of this in the intro video, but I'll do it again. We need to know, is there a contract? Has there been intention to create legal relations? Is there capacity between the parties? Are they of sound mind and know what they're doing? Is there offer and acceptance and consideration of the holy trilogy of contract formation? Then we need to know how we work out what the terms of the contract are. So certainty, completeness, express terms, implied terms. We've talked about implied terms this evening. Express is what's on the paper. Implied is what the court slips in by virtue of various different principles when there are gaps, lacunae, in the contract terms. We need to know how a court will construe terms. We need to know a little bit about privity. We also need to know about the Australian consumer law because that is the main legislative incursion into our nice little common law, judge-made bubble of law that's, generally speaking, contract law. Contract B, I call the sequel. Actually, I probably shouldn't call it the sequel because if Contract A is the prequel, there should just be a before we get a sequel. But anyway, Contract B, the sequel. In Contract B, we talk about all of the things that can go wrong with our nicely formed contract that we talk about in Contract A. So, how it all goes pear-shaped. Vitiating factors, the things that might ruin a contract for us and make it vulnerable to a court setting it aside: mistake, misrepresentation, duress, undue influence, unconscionable conduct, all of the naughtiness that goes on. We also look at things like estoppel, where a party can be stopped from going back on a promise that they made that is a non-contractual promise. So here, there's another little thought bubble for you, okay? Estoppel, a doctrine that's arisen to stop someone going back on their promise. Promise theory we've been talking about this evening. How much of a bearing does that have on the development of doctrines like estoppel? Illegality we also have a little look at in Contract B, and then we look at discharge. So have you performed well enough? Have you breached? Has the contract been frustrated? And frustration, again, we've had a little talk about tonight. Then last off, you look at the loot and the other things that you can get for your client. And that is contract for us this term and next term if you're going to do them consecutively. So that is the notion of theory and where we are in the world at this point. If you have any questions, queries, shoot me an email, post up in Facebook, send me a message, tweet me. But most importantly, Moodle, don't forget Moodle. Most importantly though, do keep in touch, and hopefully I'll get to chat with you in the week 1 Zooms. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.